Okay, so what we're going to build and deploy is just a really, really simple API application. And I've got it stored in my repository, so feel free to check it out whenever you like. This is actually where I adapted that config map secret lecture that we talked about, was from this application. It's a very, very simple application. It just sends bad dad jokes to you. But it also has a health check endpoint, which is actually a really good practice because you can leverage that as a health check in your deployment configs. And if we have time, we'll certainly do that. Now, the reason I'm showing you the code is, as we talked about, your team is that first line of defense when an application goes down or you're having issues, and they know the application the best. So your developers will be communicating with whoever's performing that DevOps function to make sure that the infrastructure is set up correctly, right? So it's a great way of being cross-functional. It's a great way of bringing the two jobs together, and break down the silos. So what I've done while we were in that break is I created a branch based off of today to work out of, and I'm gonna go ahead now and just clone this repository and bring it down to my local machine. Let's get out of this OC port for it. So I'm gonna go ahead and clone it just right in my home directory here.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah.
You might want to bring your terminal a little bit bigger.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Is that better?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. That's a good point. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get into that directory, and then I'm gonna change into that branch that I just created, and I already forgot what I called it. OCP 101 demo June 9th. Perfect. Now I'm the developer of this application, so obviously I want to just make sure that it works. So I'm going to go ahead and just test this locally, make sure that we can get this thing to work. Oh, whoops, I have to go to the API directory. Make sure this thing will actually run correctly. So I'm just installing the packages, and again, not expecting you guys to know this. This is like very specific to the stack that I'm working in, Node.js. But I'm just installing some dependencies, and then we're going to run the server. And pretty much what I should expect here is, as the server, it's listing on port 3000. I should be able to curl this port and then get a health check back. And I get API healthy, which is what I'm looking for. So I know this thing works. Great. So there's no point in trying to build and deploy an OpenShift if you can't build and deploy it locally, right? Okay, so as another precursor before we get started on this is I have opened up a working namespace for me. So this is a namespace that I have in OpenShift that I can deploy workloads. It's completely blank. And so I'm going to use this to build and deploy my applications. Now, Shelly had brought up that typically your builds happen in the tools namespace. Again, I'm not going to do that just for the sake of time. I'm going to build and deploy everything here in prod. In my prod namespace. This is my own prod namespace. So all the actions you do in OpenShift, they are against a particular namespace. So I'm just going to need to make sure that I'm in that namespace. I'm logged into it. Perfect. Okay, so now that I'm logged in, I can start by that starting lifecycle. And this kind of looks very similar to our API infrastructure right here. We're going to be following this pattern pretty much. We're going to be creating an S2I build. Then we're going to be referring to the image stream tag that build creates in a deployment config. We're going to pass in some environment variables, and that's going to create some pods. And of course, we'll create the route and service as well. So let's start off with that first stage, that S2I build. There's a few different ways you can create a build. There's a command called Osi new app. Osi new app will create your build. It's going to create your deployment config and a service. It's going to do that all for you. But I want to break this up into two different stages because this is typically what you see on our platform. I'm going to create the build first, and then we're going to create the deployment. So there's a command called Osi new build. If I didn't know how to use it, I'll run that -h flag. Whoops. So it will explain like this will create a new build. You can point it to an image. You can also point it to a repository, which is what we're going to be doing. So here, create a build config from a remote repository using its beta 2 branch. This is almost what we want to do, except we're going to use that OCP 101 branch. So OC new build my repository. Whoops, demo, and then the branch name. So OCP 101-demo-June 9th. Now this is a really neat trick. There's a flag called dry run that's available on most OC commands, which will allow you to test the command before it actually tries to create any objects. So I'm just gonna try it in dry run and see if it actually can find that repository. And sure enough, it can't. Or actually, there's an issue with this. Is that I've asked it to create a build off of this repository, but if we take a look at this repository, there is no microservice here that it can do an S2I build off of, right? The microservice is actually inside of a directory, so we need to pass in an additional flag called a context directory. So I'm going to run the command again, and I'm going to run the flag contextdir, which you can see, where is it? Contextdir right here. And I'm going to pass in that API directory, which is where this is being built off of. And let's try that again. So perfect. So this actually didn't run that build, but it did verify that the command would have worked. So let's run it for real this time. And let's add a flag called name, which is going to give it a useful name. And we're going to call this OCP 101 demo June 9th. So notice how I'm running these things in the OpenShift CLI tool. You can actually create new builds in the graphical user interface. I would urge or recommend you guys not to, because there's more utility to the command line tool. And you're going to be needing to abstract this into infrastructure code, and that's easier done on the CLI anyways. But now that I've created this build, I'm going to use the user interface and investigate what happened. So there's a builds tab, and if I click on builds, we're going to see our June 9th demo running. And this is that S2I build process. So it found that this is a Node.js project, and if I view this log, it's gonna go through that process, that S2I builder, and know that like, oh, this is an npm project. I need to do an npm install. See, it's saying installing dependencies. And then once it's done, it's gonna run npm build, and once that's done, it's gonna create the image. So this project is quite small, so it shouldn't take too much time. NPM is actually kind of funny that it takes quite a while to build things because there's so much input output from installing packages. So one of the things that we're always trying to provide better tooling to make it more efficient for teams to produce their work. So we're currently in the works with rolling out a product called Artifactory, which is a artifact registry. Pretty much allows you to store npm packages, Docker images, like any sort of artifacts. And reference them. So instead of you having to always download it from npm, for example, you can download it from Artifactory, which should speed things up. Also, it acts like as a private registry as well to your team. So if there's any like private packages that you've developed, you can store them as well there as well. So there is an Artifactory channel in Rocket Chat. You can take a look. Right now, there is just a trial that's going on. So a few select teams using it, and we'll hopefully roll that out to the public. I think hopefully within the next 3 or 4 months.
Is there an additional cost to that? Or is there any cost recovery to
that? Right now, there is not, but I know there are talks/plans as far as how we relay costs to ministries. So everything in OpenShift that we provide is free right now, but I think that's changing with OpenShift 4.3. And the plan for OpenShift 4 is that it's going to be released in the summertime. With the idea that hopefully by the start of the new year that all teams will be migrated to it. And I think at that point there might be an idea of how we do cost recovery, because right now everything's just on our branches bill.
Well, thank you.
Well, the whole entire idea was like from the beginning, like Todd's mandate was like make things better for teams, right? Like remove the blockers. Yeah. So again, like it's doing this build, and I didn't write a Docker file to create this build. This is S2I doing its thing. It seems magical, but if you went to the Node.js S2I builder image, it's just a GitHub repository. There's a script that actually explains all of this, like how it works. So I'm just waiting for this to get completed. Shouldn't be too much longer. There we go. It's fixing up permissions, and then it should be pushing that image. Perfect. it's almost ready. So when you run OC new build, it creates that build object, that build config object. It also creates an image stream tag, and it creates something called an image stream. So the image stream is like a repository for your image stream tags. And so now that it's pushed, if I go to builds and I go to images, here's our image streams, and we can see the June 9th one. And like I mentioned, by default, the builds will produce a latest tag. And so as a best practice, we're going to want to change this later on. So these parts of our infrastructure are really, really important, and we want to capture this as code. So we're going to do that. This is getting into the BC Gov best practices here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my code editor, and let's open up that project. OCP 101. There we go. So we can see here that we have, I already have the infrastructure code. We're going to pretend like this doesn't exist because we're going to start it all over again. We can see here that we have a root OpenShift directory, and this is a common pattern you're going to see in repositories in our organization. And this is a good place to store your infrastructure code. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory called API for the API microservice. And inside of that, I'm going to pass in our build infrastructure code. So how do I do that? Well, we can grab or query objects through the OC CLI tool and then actually capture that infrastructure code. So let's take a look at the objects. We want to grab this image stream. We want to grab we want to grab the image stream in the build config. When you ran that OC new build command, it applies these labels automatically for you. So build OCP101 demo, and sure enough, if I go to the build, it's going to have the exact same label. So I can actually query objects by that label. So I can run a command called OCGet. Then I can say OCGet all, which will give me almost all the OpenShift objects, just nothing that's sensitive, and then pass in that label. OC-L build equals OCP101-demo-June 9th. And it gave us our build, it gave us our build config, and the image stream. So this isn't very useful right now. We need to capture this as infrastructure code. So I'm going to run that command again, and I'm going to run the -o flag, which means output to YAML. And I'm going to stick that into the OpenShift directory as a file called buildconfig.yaml. And a quick note on OCGetAll. So OCGetAll is lying. It's not going to get you secrets. It's not going to get you persistent storage claims or PVCs. It's not going to get you config maps or role bindings or anything like that. And that's for good reason. You don't want to inadvertently store that as code. So you're going to need to actually, if you wanted to get something like a secret, you need to do like OCGetAll, comma secret, comma PVC, comma config map for it to work. Okay, so now that we've captured that infrastructure code, let's investigate. So this is our infrastructure code. Super, super cool. This is all the things that we need to create that build. Now, when you do that OCGetAll command, it gave us some stuff that's actually not needed. We talked about how deployment configs create replication controllers, and that's automatically done for you. Similarly, build configs create objects called builds, and we don't need those because that's going to be created for us. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And I apologize that I'm being fast, but I'm just being mindful of time. I want to get to the deployments. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this build object because, again, the build config will create that for us. Now, this is something that might seem a little bit crazy. This is a best practice. You want to be able to test your infrastructure. You want to be able to be confident that your infrastructure works. So I'm going to run this command. Instead of OCGetAll, I'm going to run the command OCDeleteAll. And that's going to do exactly what you think it does. Now, my pro tip is never run OCDelete unless you've run OCGet beforehand, because you do not want to be that guy that deletes your production deployment, right? Because OC commands run against a particular namespace. You want to make sure you're in the right namespace, right? Like you're not in your prod namespace when you're running OCDelete. I know that because I've done it. I deleted my Jenkins once, and thankfully we had infrastructure code. It was easy to recover, but it causes a disruption. It's a pain. So I deleted those objects, and if I take a look at OpenShift, they don't exist anymore. It's all gone. Even the image stream tags, it's all gone. But that should be okay, because we have our infrastructure code now, we can use that to create these objects again. So I'm just going to navigate to that Openshift directory. And now I can run a command called Osi Apply, which essentially applies or creates objects. And I'm passing in the -f flag for the file. And there you go. We're able to create our objects. Now, when you run Osi Apply with a build config, it doesn't automatically start the build for you. You're going to need to manually trigger it, but I could go ahead and do that and get that build started. So how does everyone feel about that?
I like it.
Great. Okay, so this is something you should be able to delete your infrastructure code and recreate it. Like that's just something you should be. If you're not confident you can delete your infrastructure, that means it's probably not set up correctly. With storage, you have to be a little bit more mindful. Like if you delete your PVC, your storage is gone. But like as far as like these like objects that can be considered transient, like you can just recreate them, you should be able to delete them. Now, I would say we're about step 1 of 3 of this actually being good infrastructure code. What we actually need to do is we need to take away that anything that's way too specific that describes like, hey, the particular, use like Openshift will provide an ID for this, a unique identifier. Anything that's too specific, we want to abstract away, and we want to eventually create this or turn this into a template so that we can pass in variables as parameters. So one thing you can do is all OpenShift objects will not require these 3 fields: resource version, self-link, or UID. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that from this build config. And I'm going to go ahead and delete that from this image stream as well. So you won't need those. And another thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to convert this into a template object. We haven't talked about templates until now, but templates is what you're going to be actually saving. Templates is a way to be able to create instances of these OpenShift objects based on different parameters. And that's how you typically would save your code. So now that this is a template, there's a few extra things we can do. We can add in parameters, so we can add in some variables. So I'm going to do one right now. Parameters, I'm going to do a couple. One parameter is going to be name, and I'm going to say it's required. And I'm going to give it a description saying the name of the components. And the other one is going to be the image tag, the output image stream tag. You see where I'm going with this? So what am I going to do with that name? Well, everywhere that I said OCP 101 June 9th, I'm going to replace that with the name variable. And as far as that output tag in the build config, there you go, this field right here. I'm going to change that with image tag. And there's actually a last few things I need to clear up here. The status field, particularly in this image stream, is not needed. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, because it's got too much specific information of how this thing was run in the past, and we don't really care about that when it comes to templates. I think everything else is okay. This secret information we're going to deal with eventually, but let's just deal with that for now. I think this will be great. And actually, creation timestamp we don't need either.
Is there a quick way to validate this before we actually build it? If we do kind of remove something that we weren't supposed to remove? Yeah,
the quickest way is to try to build it. If it works. If it works or doesn't
Perfect.
work. Yeah. So now that I've created this OpenShift template, I can run a command called OC process against that template. You can no longer create it because it's not a set of OpenShift objects yet. It's just a template of OpenShift objects. And I'm going to add those parameters. So the name this time is going to be dad joke API, which is what this thing actually is. And then the image tag is going to be dev. And if I press enter, let's just see what happens. So there you go. Here's our JSON format of our infrastructure. The next thing I can do is now pipe that into an OC apply, and hopefully it creates our infrastructure. So now we have the same infrastructure, but in with some slightly different configuration, right? So this is where the power is really evident of like templates. So sure enough, here's our dad joke API. And again, if we would need to manually trigger the build. I think it's because I've got the image change trigger set up incorrectly. But sure enough, here is now our template, and it's like almost ready to go. So this is about step 2 in good infrastructure code. Step 3 is like cleaning this up further, and I'm getting some more variables in there. For instance, namespace might be too specific. We might actually want to add some more labels. We want to definitely, right now, that this build has a best effort style compute resources. So we might want to configure this build to only consume a finite amount of resources. So how do I know like what these fields are and how to use them? Like what's the data that you can put in there? This is in the Osi cheat sheet in your in the Miro board, but there's a really great command called Osi Explain. And Osi Explain will take in an OpenShift object, and it's going to tell you the top level fields of that object. So API version, kind, metadata spec. So API version, kind, metadata spec. And let's just say I wanted to know how those resources worked. I could go osexplain.buildconfig.spec.resources. And it's going to tell you, okay, that we need to know the request. We need to know what's in there. So then we go down to requests, and it'll explain further how you need to use it. So this is how I learned about these, how to work with these infrastructure pieces. It just takes some time, that's all. Now, one thing that I actually do is I'm just going to go backtrack here, is for any of the Node.js developers in the room, converting things to templates is tedious. So we have a package, an npm package called Osi template, and that will easily convert a OpenShift manifest into a template and remove some of those like unneeded fields and objects. So in order to run it, you would need Node.js on your machine, but you can run npx at bcgov Osi template, and then the command to template, and then the file name. So // oh no, it's right here, /bc.yaml. So this is again, we're platform services trying to develop tools to make like things as easy as possible. And so this is one of the tools. It will convert a manifest into a template, but it is a Node.js package. You would need Node.js to run it. So there we go. Converted a template. It got rid of the build config. It got rid of like all those fields that we didn't need, like creation timestamp. Oh, it doesn't get rid of the builds. So that's something that needs addressing. That sounds like a bug. It will get rid of replication controllers though. And then lastly, after this, you could add your the parameters again to get that in there. So I'm just going to add the name one again, not the image tag, just for time's sake. And then we're going to talk about deployments. Required true. And then let's go. Perfect.
Is there a limit, while you're typing, is there a limit to objects that can be put in one template file? Can you put like pretty much your...
As many as you need, yeah.
As many as you need? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Now, I don't actually need these triggers. So the GitHub change trigger is, I do believe that's a webhook trigger. And the generic one is a webhook trigger as well. So I don't need these. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of them. And I'm going to get rid of, actually, just those two. So that's great. Now what I want to do is I want to commit these changes. Add build config infrastructure code. And then I would push that into a repository. All right, so now that we've talked about the build config portion, yeah, the dad joke API didn't work for some reason, but I'm not going to deal with that right now. Let's go back to our original build config here. Let's talk about the deployment part. So this part here. So the deployment takes an image stream tag, and it takes a set of environment variables, and that will create some pods for us. So a really great command to get that process bootstrapped is called Osi new app. And if I, again, didn't know how to use it, I'd run the new app command and then -h, and it explains how it'll create a deployment config. It'll create a service as well, And what we're actually looking for is we're actually going to point it to a image stream, and specifically the image stream tag. So I'm going to go ahead and find that image stream, and it's the latest tag, and we're gonna use that one. So I'm going to run Osi new app, and then I'm going to point it to this image stream tag. So OCP 101-demo-June 9th latest. And although we said thou shalt not use latest, again, this is just for demonstration purposes / me running out of time here. So again, good idea, run that dry run flag. This will verify whether you've entered this correctly. So it's saying it is creating. So let's run this for real this time. Perfect. So now we should start seeing a deployment running of our S2I build, or of that image. Now, my guess is that this is actually not going to work correctly yet, and that's because we have our service by default is trying to target port 8080, and I almost guarantee that this thing's not running on port 8080. So if I take a look at this pod logs, it's saying it's running on port 3000. So how can we change that? Well, again, your developers know your application the best, right? So they, if they're doing cloud native principles, they've configured an environment variable called port so that you can change that port to 8080. So we're going to go ahead and do that. First things first is let's get our deployment infrastructure code as code and bring it down into our project. So it created a label, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to get these objects by the label and then start messing around with the configuration. So OC get all -L app equals OCP 101-demo-June 9th. We're going to turn that into YAML, and we're going to turn that into a file called dc.yaml or deploymentconfig.yaml. Perfect. So let's investigate this file. So again, it grabs everything. It grabs the pods. It's going to grab the replication controller as well. And these are things that we don't actually want in our infrastructure code. But let's take a look at that service object. So I mentioned that it's pointing to a container port that that's not the right one. So it's saying, container port's 8080, and the service is pointing to that port as well, target port 8080. Well, what we need to do is we need to configure our container to run with an environment variable that will change it to that port. And so let's do that. And before we do that, I'm going to just clean up this file and turn it into a template using the same process that we did before with that toTemplate function. This is just to speed things up. Perfect. So as you can see, it really stripped this down, right? Like really stripped this down. So this is what you want to see. So there's a lot of fluff that you don't need in your infrastructure. What we might want to do is grab some parameters and configure our deployment config. So I'm going to add a new parameter. I'm going to call it app port. And I'm going to say maybe not required true, but maybe its default value is 8080. Actually, this might not work because I know parameters need to be a string. So we'll see if this works. It might not. And then we're going to change this to be app port. We're also going to change the target port for this service to be app port. But we're not done yet. We need to add an environment variable. And I know we gave you like a little snapshot of what that looks like in the Miro board. So let's take a look at how we can add environment variables. I'm going to leverage Osi Explain. So I just happen to know that environment variables are inside the dc.spec.template.spec field. Oh, .containers, my bad, .containers. There we go. So containers, and then there's a value called environment, which is a list of objects. So when I take a look at my deployment config, here's that strategy that we were talking about earlier in the day. There's template, spec, containers, and inside the containers, there's a new field that we can add called environment. And in environment, let's see what it takes. Again, I never memorize this stuff. I just always like look at it. So the name of it is whatever our app called it, and our app called it port. So that's what we're going to call it. And then it takes in a value, and this is the app port. This may or may not work. Let's see, because again, I have a feeling that this being a number value is going to make it fail, but let's see if it works. So we're going to run the command Osi process-f, the DC YAML file, and then let's pipe that into an Osi apply. Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. This is not going to work because this is a string or a number. I knew it. Ports is like the one thing that's kind of like not easy to do. So let's get rid of that parameters for now. And instead, we're going to say that this thing was 8080 in the infrastructure code. Let's make this 8080. Now, you might be thinking like, hey, this is hard coded, but this is a little bit different compared to your application code, right? The application's already built. This is just the infrastructure, which means you can just recreate it or delete it and recreate it, and you can do that kind of like consistently. So that should work fine. So I'm going to run OC process again. Oh, dash. What am I missing here, Shelly? Oh, this might be it. There you go. There we go. So now it says configured. And so let's investigate our deployment config. Hey, look at that. It's starting to redeploy automatically, right? And that's because it has that config change trigger. If we take a look at our deployment config, you're going to see the triggers and it says config change. So anything that happens in, I do believe the template fields will trigger a config change. And here's our app deployed. Let's just double check those logs. Listening on port 8080. So are we done yet? No, because this is a dad joke API. Ideally the public can access this. So we're going to need to create a route, and OC new app will not create a route by default. There's another command that you need to do, and that's called Osi expose. So it will say, Osi expose, expose containers internally as a service or externally via routes. So we're going to do it, expose a route. So we need to pass in the service name. So Osi expose service and then the service name. And if I take a look at services, that's the one that we care about. Great. So a route's been created. So now I should have an application that says API healthy. There we go. Our application is deployed. And it should have an endpoint called /joke. Oh, maybe not joke, /something. Again, I was the developer, right? I should know this application the best, ideally. Is it called /joke? Oh, we got a funny error, internal server error. So let's debug that. This is totally not planned, by the way. Regenerator runtime is not defined. This is probably a packaging issue. This was not planned, and it's going to take way too long to debug. But let's just assume that joke part worked. The API endpoint worked, so that's cool. So we've made a change in our infrastructure that has made this application, work. It's now, accessible by the internet. But there is a small problem here. If I did that OC get command way back when, right? If you guys remember that. So OC get all. Now, what did I say? I said you should be able to comfortably delete your infrastructure code. There we go, it's deleted. And once it's all deleted, you should be able to run your infrastructure code, and it should work again. And sure enough, it's deploying, but there's something missing, right? Can anyone point out what's missing?
Your route.
Your route. Yeah, exactly. So the route is not there. So we need to capture that route as configuration code and stick it into our template. So I'm going to expose that route again. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab that route and get the infrastructure code. So Osi get route OSP 101 demo. And I'm just going to copy that, that YAML. I could have piped this into PB copy because I'm a Mac, but I didn't. And then I'm going to go ahead to that deployment config file and make sure, just making sure my indents are correct. Oh, one more. Whoops. There we go. So now that's in, but again, there's way too much specific information. So we're going to clear that stuff. We're going to clear this stuff. And everything else, and the status again is just not something that we need either. Now, if I run that command again, so it deleted the route, deleted the service. Now if I do OC, that Osi apply process thing, there we go. It said it created the route. And look, so there we go. Now we have like essentially idempotent infrastructure, right? We deleted and recreated, and it's still there. Nothing else has changed, right? So this is a really good practice when you're testing infrastructure. Like you want to make sure it works. Now I'm running out of time, but what I would be doing next, of course, is like abstracting a lot of the contents of this configuration into variables, into parameters, even the image stream tag, because then that way we have this infrastructure code, and now we can deploy it in test, deploy it in prod, deploy it in dev, and all we need to do is pass in a new variable for the image stream tag. Similarly, you might want to, I can't remember how to get around the container port because sometimes it's a number and sometimes it's a string. I can't remember that. But yeah, another thing you might want to do is you might want to add more specific labels. Like for example, if there was a config map that we wanted to mount into this, we might add some different labels to isolate it away from the rest of the application. And that's it, guys. So I'm a bit running out of time here, but that was the gist of what I wanted to demo. We have a working application. Actually, one last thing I'll quickly show you guys is we talked about health checks, and this is a really good idea. So I'm in my deployment config, and in this actions tab, you can add health checks. So I'm going to add something called a liveness probe. And again, it says it just checks to see if your container is still running. It's like a definition of your containers running. So I'm just going to do it through the GUI. But what you'd want to do again is this is going to change your deployment config. So you're going to need to pull those changes down and store them in your code. So we're going to do an HTTP GET request to that endpoint /. And let's give it an initial delay of like 10 seconds after the pod starts. And we're going to save that. And it's going to create a new deployment and then do that readiness check. And then what would we do is we would now go grab that deployment config. And like what I do, everyone has their own process of doing this. What I actually do is I look for the check, the readiness check, and then I add it in there. So liveness pros, I would be adding this into my deployment config. Was that in the container spec? I can't remember. Yeah. So I would be just copy and pasting this and then adding this like right here. And then you do that. And so this is the interesting point, is where your DevOps interfaces with the application, right? Like so that your developers created a route to test whether your applications are healthy or not. And that's a really good practice. Sometimes you'll see people call this like ELO. I can't remember what that stands for. But then you can leverage it with a liveness probe in your deployment config. Again, I encourage you guys to Google that or just ask the DevOps how-to. The OpenShift 101 labs that we're developing, we'll go over this as well. So yeah, I think that's going to close things off as far as the demo. Last things I would do is just probably commit this code and push it and just, test. Then eventually, wrap this in automation. And that's actually one thing I'm doing right now with one of the teams I'm with is wrapping this with Ansible and GitHub Actions to do our deployments and builds for us. All right. So yeah, that kind of concludes everything for me here. Again, I think on behalf of Shelly and I, wanted to thank you guys for being with us during this. I know it's been a lot of technical bits and a lot of us talking, but hopefully you guys got some of the things you needed out of the course. And yeah, we'd love feedback. So please take a look at that SurveyMonkey email. You should be getting that soon. And yeah, you can always email me if you have any questions.
Just one more thing that me and Patrick are working on the lab contents. So once that's done, stay tuned. We'll reach out to you guys and set up sessions available there.
Yeah, definitely. So that's something. It's going to be in version 4.2. So everything I've demonstrated is going to look a lot different. Yeah.